Good evening, and welcome to the Democracy series, hosted by the Center for Effective Government and the Chicago Center on Democracy at the University of Chicago and the Seminary Co-op Bookstores. My name is Kevin Cromash, and I'm the Senior Research Associate at the Chicago Center on Democracy. Our centers bring together scholars and practitioners to host discussions and generate ideas about how we can strengthen democratic institutions in service of a more effective government. In today's installment of this book series, we're speaking with author Yascha Mounk on his book, The Great Experiment: Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. We'll have the opportunity today to hear him speak about various aspects of his book, and we'll save time for audience questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A function at any point. Tonight's conversation is being recorded and will be shared on Twitter at uChicagoCEG and at democracy.uchicago.edu. If you enjoy the conversation today, I encourage you to attend future Democracy series events where we will continue to explore the state of democracy. Yascha Mounk is a writer, academic, and public speaker known for his work on the crisis of democracy and the defense of philosophically liberal values. He is an associate professor of the practice of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University, contributing editor at The Atlantic, senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and the founder of Persuasion, which is a platform for writing and community around the defense of a free society. Our conversation will center on the ideas in Yascha's new book, The Great Experiment, which is an excellent exploration of one of the greatest challenges of our time: how diverse democracies can be stable, functional, and inclusive. And I'm delighted to present our moderator, the director of the Chicago Center on Democracy, Professor Susan Stokes. In addition to her role as the center's director, Sue is the Margaret Blake Distinguished Service Professor in the University of Chicago's Political Science Department. So Sue and Yascha, I'll turn it over to you for what I know will be an exciting conversation.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and wonderful to have you here, Yascha. It's I really enjoyed reading your book, and I'm glad that we're going to have a chance to talk about it with an audience that I'm sure will find it of great interest. So I think the first thing we're going to do is just have you spend a few minutes talking to us. It's a book. The very title is, as titles should be, very clear about its goals, about explaining how diverse democracies fall apart and how that outcome can be avoided. So talk to us a little bit about your book.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Look, the starting point for this book is a recognition that we are now in what I call a historically unprecedented situation of trying to build ethnically and religiously diverse democracies that actually treat all of their members as true equals. What we've had historically is a bunch of diverse societies with varying success that were not democracies. What we've had is countries like Germany, where I grew up after World War II, which were democracies that were, by comparison to today, very ethnically and religiously homogeneous. And what we had, of course, were democracies like the one in the United States, which were founded at a time when the country was already diverse, but which were not diverse in terms of their democracy, because it excluded, in at times extreme ways, anybody who did not belong to a kind of ruling ethnic or religious group. And so that is why what we're facing is a great experiment. It is an unprecedented situation for which there isn't a very clear or straightforward historical precedent, where it's not entirely clear what rules and norms we need to make it succeed. And one of the things that I find striking about this moment is that there's a lot of pessimism about success. There's pessimism about its success from the right and the far right, and from the extreme and violent right, as we saw in Buffalo. But there's also a lot of skepticism about the state of our society and the prospects for improvements that comes more from the left and the center of public discourse and academic inquiry. And so what I'm trying to do is to put forward an optimistic vision of how we might actually build ethnically and religiously diverse societies in which a majority of citizens would be excited to live. So let me say 3 brief things in these opening remarks, and I'll try and keep them sort of telegraphic and limited, because I'm really looking forward to the conversation and to diving into this in greater detail in the rest of our time together. But I'm going to try and do 3 things. The first is to show why it's actually hard to build ethnically and religiously diverse democracies and why we need to take those difficulties seriously. The second is to talk about how an account of those difficulties can justify a hard-won optimism, and in fact, a lack of understanding of them can lead us towards a fatalism, which I think is mistaken. And thirdly, just to outline a couple of key points of the vision for the kind of society that we should try and build together. So starting off, I teach at Johns Hopkins, which is a great university and a wonderfully diverse campus. And my students think of themselves as some of the most tolerant people in the world, and in some ways, probably they are. But I find it striking that when I ask them whether a hot dog is a sandwich and have them debate that question for 5 or 10 minutes, they end up discriminating against those of a different point of view in a game that I have them play afterwards. And so the first difficulty of building diverse democracies is simply that there is a strong human nature, a strong human instinct towards forming groups, favoring the members of those groups, and discriminating against outsiders. And we've seen this again and again in academic research, again and again in history, again and again in many different parts of the world today. So the question of how to build diverse democracies is always, in part, the question of how to deal in a constructive way with the groupishness, which is part of human inheritance and always will be. The second difficulty is that most groups in the history of the world that were really politically important were not quite as arbitrary or quite as trivial as that of people who believe that a hot dog is a sandwich or people who believe that a hot dog is not a sandwich. When you look at some of the most protracted and violent conflicts in the history of the world, at some of the worst crimes of humanity, from wars to civil wars to genocides and forms of ethnic cleansing, some of them were motivated by distinctions that are perhaps hard to understand today, by distinctions between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, for example. But most of them did pit members of ethnic, religious, cultural, national, linguistic, or racial groups against each other. And so we know from human history that the project of managing human groupishness is especially difficult in moments and in situations when these different ethnic or religious or cultural groups are trying to cooperate in a society or are trying to vie for dominance in a society. And then the third difficulty is that this is called the democracy series. As a great believer in democracy, I would like to think that democratic institutions make it easier to sustain these diverse democracies. And I think rightly understood, the institutions of liberal democracy can in fact do so. But the basic democratic mechanism is as likely to incite tensions as it is to reduce them. When you think of some of the most harmonious, diverse societies in the history of the world, imperfect societies, but societies where we can look to for some inspiration, many of them were monarchies or empires, from Baghdad in the 9th century to Vienna in the 19th century. And there is a reason for that, because too, if you and I don't have any political power and have to rely on a monarch for some amount of protection, then if your ethnic group has more kids or has more immigrants who are coming in, that doesn't immediately change my political standing. And so I don't have any strong reason to be concerned about it. In a democracy, it's much more tempting to think, well, I used to be in the majority and that gave me a certain amount of power and a certain amount of standing in society. But hang on a second, if suddenly your group is going to be bigger than mine, then perhaps all of that will change. Democracy is always a search for electoral majorities, and that can actually inflame ethnic and religious and cultural divisions within a society in worrying ways. So if you take those 3 things together, those 3 points together, you realize that the project of building diverse democracies is far from trivial. It has historically often gone wrong, and it might go wrong again in the future. Now, That sounds bracing and it sounds pessimistic. And yet, ironically, I would argue that it can be a source of optimism as well. Because the way that we often think about this topic, it seems to me, is to say, look, we should find it really easy to build diverse democracies. We should find it easy to get along. How hard is it to like your neighbor? How hard is it not to be a bigot? How hard is it not to be a racist? And yet we're seeing all of these deep problems and tensions in our society, and we're seeing discrimination and racism in our society. And so that must mean that there's something uniquely wrong with our society, and it must mean that there's very little room to hope for a better future. If we're failing that thoroughly at an easy task, why should we think that we might be able to do better in future? I think when you assess the situation today in diverse democracies around the world, in the United States, but also in Germany and also in Sweden and also in Australia and Canada and other places, with a basis in the account of why this is a really hard undertaking, you can take a somewhat more optimistic and positive view. You can say that there are many injustices that we have to continue to struggle against, but we have actually made real progress over the course of the last decades. We're starting to understand some of the principles which can guide that society, and we can continue to make real progress in decades to come. I have a much more detailed account of the grounds for optimism in the book, but just to mention two facts which I think are instructive. The first is that in 1960, about 6% of the US population thought that it was morally acceptable for a white and a Black American to marry each other. 6% within the lifetime of many faculty members at universities around the country. Today, 6% of the US population thinks that it is morally unacceptable for a white or Black American to marry each other. So we've gone from nearly universal agreement on the immorality of interracial marriage to nearly universal agreement on the morality of it over the span of a lifetime. That is a remarkable transformation. And we know that this is not just a case of social desirability bias, of people telling pollsters what they want to hear, because of actual sociological changes in society. So it used to be that a few decades ago, but about 1 in 33 newborns were interracial in the United States. Now it is about 1 in 7. So a very rapid increase in actual behavior. To name a very different example, we're seeing a lot of pessimism and a lot of fear elicited by immigration. And we have accounts on the far right which essentially claim that Irish and Italian immigrants could succeed a century ago because they were, quote unquote, the right kind of immigrants, and that immigrants today from Mexico or Salvador or Vietnam or Kenya or Nigeria are not going to succeed because there's supposedly something wrong or inferior about them. Now, the mainstream and the left of society rightly reject that analysis, but I'm struck that there's often a similar pessimism, which I hear from my own colleagues and acquaintances and friends, which is to say that Italian and Irish immigrants could succeed a century ago because they were white and they didn't face the same kind of discrimination. And the immigrants that are in the majority today will never succeed because of the extent of racism and discrimination that they face. And so they're extremely marginalized and not integrating into our society and not experiencing socioeconomic progress. Now, again, there undoubtedly is racism and discrimination that immigrants and non-white immigrants today experience in the United States, and there's very clear research on that. But the best empirical research on how they're doing also shows that this pessimism is ill-founded, that the first generation often struggles, the second generation usually makes significant socioeconomic and educational progress, and that accelerates in the third generation, so that actually the speed of socioeconomic progress and integration today for Mexican and Salvadorian and Vietnamese and Kenyan and Nigerian immigrants is about the same as it was 100 years ago for Italian and Irish immigrants. But obviously, and surprisingly, proves wrong the far right, which worries that there's something quote unquote wrong with those immigrants. But it also disproves the pessimism that's fashionable in my own intellectual circles, that they simply are not being given an opportunity to succeed. Despite obstacles, they are succeeding. And so I think that should allow us to say, on the basis of the hard-won progress over the last decades, we should strive towards more progress, and we need a set of principles for what that would look like. And again, very, very briefly, I'm going to telegraph 3 or 4 points of that vision. The first is that we need the principles of philosophical liberalism as a basis for our society. And in particular, we need to grant the citizens of diverse democracies 2 kinds of freedoms. The first is the freedom to be protected from a tyrannical government and the tyranny of a majority. It is the freedom to ensure that you can criticize the president or prime minister without having to fear that you might go to jail, unlike what we've seen in Russia in the last months, for example. It is the assurance that you can worship in a congregation that may not be popular, that may have religious beliefs which a majority of a population does not share, without having to worry that somebody is going to attack you at your house of worship. But it is also the freedom to escape what your colleague James Robinson and Dan Acemoglu in the narrow corridor call the cage of norms. It is also the freedom to ensure that people who, most people choose to remain members of their own communities, but those who say that they disagree with the religious beliefs of their parents or perhaps the cultural practice of their parents, or they want to go and strike out on their own and move to a different city within the country, live very differently, they must also be free to do so. And so what we need is a liberalism which is attuned to the importance of groups, but which also ensures that the state is strong enough to stop communities from in turn becoming oppressive to their own members. So that's the first point. The second point is that I think there's been a lot of debate over the course of 75, 80 years about the right metaphor for what a diverse society and an immigrant society should look like. One metaphor is that of a melting pot, which I think asks people to become too homogeneous, asks them to give up their groupishness and their heterogeneity to too great an extent. The alternative to it that has often been posited has been the salad bowl or the mosaic. I think that that's equally misleading because it envisages a society in which we don't have individual rights or duties, but are thus defined as members of groups, in which we have a kind of association of associations. And it would raise the danger that we might end up with deep social fragmentation and political violence down the road. And so what I suggest is a third alternative, which I call the public park. Because in a public park, Sue, you and I, after this conversation, if we were in the same city, which sadly we're not, we could go to the park and continue to have this conversation. So we just want to talk about these topics, not talk to anybody else, or we might be able to go and encounter strangers and new people and people we don't know and forge new links with them. In a free society, you have those choices. You can be an Amish who says, I'm going to live most of my life within the Amish community. And you can also say, I'm going to go and move to a city and make friends with people who are very different from me. We need a minimum of connective tissue to make society work. We need a minimum of number of people to make the choice to go out there and forge those new connections. But each citizen is free to make whatever choice they take. And that, I think, is the usefulness of a public park as a metaphor. Third, I'm a German Jew, so patriotism does not come naturally to me. But I think as we're seeing in the Ukraine at the moment, with millions of people volunteering, it's still a volunteer army to protect the country against a terrible invasion by Vladimir Putin. Patriotism can also be a force for solidarity and good, can be something which pushes the circle of human sympathy beyond the subnational groups which sometimes constrain it. And so it's something we should embrace. But we should reject ethnic nationalism. Ethnicity should not be the basis of who is an American or who is a German or an Italian. We should embrace constitutional and civic patriotism. And as a Newman American citizen, that does come easily to me. It is one of the reasons why I was proud to swear in the spring of 2017 to defend the United States Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. But we should also be realistic that most people are not defined by the politics, and most people don't care that much about politics. And so a realistic account of patriotism, I think, has to add a second dimension of everyday cultural patriotism. And what I mean by that is not a celebration of the costumes that people wore as they walk down the plank from the Mayflower, but rather the love that people have for their own country in reality, which is a love of its cities and landscapes, its sights and sounds and smells, its cultural scripts which govern how we interact, its celebrities and its TikTok stars. And that in a country like the United States today actually is a diverse, forward-looking, dynamic culture, which bears the mark of the influence of all the many people from different parts of the world who are living in the country today, and we shouldn't shy away from that. Let me end quickly on something I've been thinking about in particular over the last days. We saw the power that this terrible conspiracy theory about a great replacement has on the minds of many people, including some mentally ill people like the person who perpetrated this terrible attack in Buffalo. I think what we don't think about enough is that there is a very mainstream theory which is actually embraced, which may be the one idea that a lot of liberals and conservatives, a lot of Democrats and Republicans in the United States at the moment both embrace, which is a kind of cousin to that theory, which has more similarity than we should be comfortable with to that theory. Whereas the Great Replacement says that this is being deliberately done, this theory says it's not deliberate, and that's an important distinction. But this theory basically says that America will be majority-minority by 2045, that this will have a fundamental impact on American society, and that in particular, it'll help Democrats win elections because of a rising demographic majority. That is not so far away from replacement theory. And I think that it is empirically wrong and normatively noxious. It is empirically wrong because demographics is not destiny. Irish Americans were the most reliable voting bloc for Democrats in 1960. Now they are one of the most reliable voting blocs for Republicans. We're seeing that Latinos are rapidly shifting towards the Republican Party. In one poll, which is a bit of an outlier, but a very interesting one, Latinos are now more likely to favor the Republican Party than whites, according to a poll a couple of days ago. And we saw in 2020 that Trump was competitive because he really increased the share of the vote among every non-white voter groups, and Joe Biden became president in good part because he increased the share of the white vote relative to Hillary Clinton in 2016. So politically, this theory is wrong, but more fundamentally, I think it misdescribes the sociological reality of the United States. We have a lot of mixed-race Americans who have complicated identity. We have Hispanics, many of whom think of themselves as whites explicitly rather than as people of color. Where Asian Americans fit into the very complicated racial dynamics in the United States is, I think, in flux and not yet entirely clear. The idea that we can think about America as just fundamentally a clash between whites and people of color is very wrong-headed. It is an idea that is fashionable in many of my intellectual circles as well. And I think, as we've been seeing, it is a very dangerous idea which we should reject. And most importantly, we should build towards a society in which that is less and less true. So on that note, and with a consciousness that I went on a little bit longer than I had hoped, back to Sue.
Well, I think anyone who hears you talking so eloquently and seamlessly about this project will know that the book itself is equally elegantly written and really very. It's an easy read. The ideas are sometimes complex, but it's a very engaging read. I really do recommend it. I had a number of questions. I love the optimism. I, by nature, am an extremely optimistic person, irritatingly so, I'm told. So it's fun for me to play the role of the hard-nosed pessimist here, or the hard-nosed person. Here's one thing that surprised me in the book. I am not a historian, neither of us is, but I was surprised at the sense in the book, and correct me if I'm misreading, that this is a new experiment for the United States. My understanding of 19th century and even in some regards 18th century American history is that we've been a magnet for immigrant groups for certainly in the 19th century. We had vast waves of, you mentioned, Irish people, Italians, Eastern Europeans, and Mexicans, and so on and so forth. And I think that those people, you mentioned the successes, and the point is extremely important and very well taken. But you seem to be saying that that was not a process that led to the integration of those groups into our democracy. Now, our democracy has foundered in earlier periods. It's not been a smooth ride, and certainly not a kind of upward, kind of upward smooth slope. But there's a case to be made that the 19th century has had many periods in which it's a story of the successful incorporation of those groups into American democracy. So is it so new? And if not, if the experiment has been undertaken before, even in the United States, and has worked to some degree, with all of the limitations that go with that, including the delay in the enfranchisement of women, the painful, long, and still very incomplete process of effective enfranchisement of African Americans, and so on. Even so, if there's moments of success in these earlier experiments, what can we learn from them that can give us confidence that we would know how to push forward in this period?
Yeah, I don't disagree with you with the broad strokes of what you said. I think I disagree on a couple of important points of detail, but I think broadly speaking, I agree with that, and it's one of the reasons why I think we should be conscious of the successes, of the past success of our society, and we should be conscious of the tremendous progress we've made, in particular, over the last decades. And so, in the debate on whether we should be passionate meliorists who are very clear-eyed about the injustices in our society today, but who think that they can essentially be remedied by living up more fully to the ideals which have imperfectly inspired our society since its founding, or whether we should throw all of those principles overboard because only a society which is structured explicitly around the rights and duties of groups can possibly do justice to the oppressed. I'm very clearly on the side of the former, right? I'm very clearly on the side of the people who think that the founding ideals of the United States are in need of certain amount of amendment and evolution, but essentially the right ones. The historical crime has been not to live up to them. So in that sense, I certainly agree with you. I also agree with you that America does have came to the great experiment by a different path. That the path of a country like Germany, as I put it in the book, is soft domination. So at the time it was founded, it said, our institutions are universal and everybody's included. It just so happens that everybody who's actually a citizen in 1950, with very few exceptions, is a Christian, not necessarily a religious Christian, but somebody who comes from a Christian family, not a Jewish family or a Muslim family, and somebody who has parents and grandparents and great-grandparents who lived in a German state, right? So that was a form of soft domination. The United States has historically had a form of hard domination, where it had a lot of immigrants who were sometimes discriminated against, but integrated quite quickly into the society. But that was possible in part because it had very explicit exploitation and exclusion of a number of groups, including Native Americans and obviously in particular African Americans. And so I think one way of thinking, one of the things that I think is wrong about the idea of the growing majority-minority America, or of whites versus people of color, and the kinds of ways that we tend to talk about America, is that in certain respects, the history of America has been white versus non-white. I think in much more important respects, it's been black versus non-black. And so the people who were on the non-black side of the ledger could be integrated more easily because they were on the quote-unquote right side of the starkest divide. And on that, I think that obviously there was a moment of reconstruction, which was hopeful and so on, and which then failed. You can locate, some hope in those few decades, but essentially until the 1950s and 1960s and the real progress of the last 50 years, America did not embark on the great experiment in that respect. It did not, in fact, try to treat its Black citizens as equals. And that is something new that is happening now. Now, there are two important points which flow from that. The first is that we do, in fact, have great strength in integrating immigrants. And that's why I think the idea that we're failing at that now is simply wrong-headed. If you look at the history of immigration, it always came with some real problems, and it always took a good number of decades for the average immigrant or their descendants to reach the median income. That's continuing to be the case, but as I was saying, actually at about the same pace as in the past. And so I think that should give us a lot of confidence about what life is going to look like for the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of immigrants who are in our society today. And then the second point of hope is that what the American mainstream is, as Richard Alber, the sociologist, rightly argues, has historically been quite fluid, and I think it'll continue to be fluid, and it can be more and more inclusive, and hopefully it will never exclude one group in toto. And I think today, when you look at what the American mainstream is, in fact, it already is much more variegated than many people want to believe, and that too perhaps speaks to some of the optimism that you touch on.
I love the metaphor of the park. I love the idea of the park as the place where you can choose to go or not go. And if you choose to go, you are likely to be in the presence of people you don't know, and possibly people from quite different backgrounds, different ethnic racial groups, different sexual orientation, etc. I guess the question is, again, let me play the pessimist here. You mentioned the increased, not just in survey tolerance, but actual behavioral changes in intermarriage between racial groups and ethnic groups. What we have now is intolerance toward people of other political parties, the other political party. So, now we as parents, God forbid that my son would date a Republican or what have you. And that comes out in surveys and so on. So, how do you get people to the park, people who really don't believe, they think they don't have the same values. Maybe they do more than they realize. They certainly have different factual beliefs about the political world. And not only do they believe that the political world, one side thinks that we have a usurper in the presidential, in the White House. The other side thinks that we have a coup mongerer who wants to run for president again. So not only do they have different factual beliefs, but they think that the other side is intentionally trying to harm them. So what do we do? And what do we do to get those people to the park, or potentially to the park? And in your answer, I've struck in the book that a lot of it is sort of sociological, or points to social trends and actions of social actors as potential, improvements to the situation. But I also want to know about public policy. What do we do in the political sphere to solve these problems? So I've thrown a couple of big questions at you, but go ahead.
Yeah, all small and easy questions, as I was expecting.
All easy.
So again, I agree with much of this analysis. In fact, I've been writing a piece that should be out in the Atlantic in the next few days about this very interesting new study that Jennifer McCoy and a bunch of her colleagues at Carnegie have done on polarization, which shows that at least supposedly, I'm a little bit skeptical of the VDEM data that they base this finding on. America is now by far and away the most polarized, and in partisan terms, polarized society that's a developed democracy. But there's really very little precedent for that. And that we don't know how to get out of that. So I think that we have to take it very seriously, and I feel it, right? I mean, I spent the fall in Europe, and you can have open debates in a thoughtful manner with people who are on a different side of a political spectrum in Germany and France and so on, in a way that you simply cannot in the United States. It's something that is really visceral, actually, in this society. And I'll say something personal, which is that I came to this country as an immigrant, as a kind of privileged immigrant, to come do a PhD in political science. But I'm struck by what I've experienced of this country and what I haven't experienced of this country. So Look, I'm sure you could look at my set of friends and acquaintances and so on and say that they could be more ethnically or religiously diverse. They're pretty ethnically and religiously diverse, actually. They're not at all socioeconomically diverse, and they're even less educationally diverse. Virtually every single person I know in this country has a college degree from a selective university, probably has a graduate degree, or is about to go and get a graduate degree at some later point in life, if I'm 22-year-olds or students or whatever, right? That, I think, is really influencing how this country operates. And I'm sometimes struck by the disdain that people in our social circles can have for the average citizen. One of the worries I have is that perhaps logically, but not sociologically, can you have trust in democracy if you have given up hope that most people, most of the time, are receptive to some reasoned argument, that they're capable of responding to moral considerations. And I would say that the majority of political scientists I know in the country no longer believe that. And in that sense, I'm not sure how committed they are to democracy, actually. So I think that there is a deeply corrosive impact from this partisan polarization. And the studies seem to show that, as you're alluding to. It used to be that people would have been horrified if a child wanted to marry somebody of a different race. Now, thankfully, that is no longer the case. But many people now, and I'm not equating those two things, but many people now are horrified if a child wants to marry somebody from a different political party, right? There's interesting studies using CVs and a sort of classic research design in which it turns out that you get random people into the lab and ask them to hand out scholarships. They don't discriminate on the basis of race very much. In fact, white Americans positively discriminate in favor of African Americans in giving out scholarships rather than discriminating against them, as you might suspect. But there's extremely strong discrimination if this fictitious high school student was the president of the Democrat club if you're a Republican, or the Republican club if you were a Democrat. So the way that I'm trying to put these ideas together, and I've really been thinking about this and writing this article, is that there's some hope that polarization is not quite as bad as the headline findings from VDEM and this Carnegie study suggest. Because in most societies where you have really pernicious and deep polarization, it coincides with ethnic and religious boundaries, right? You can tell on which side of the divide somebody is by looking at them. You can tell when they walk into your store, into your neighborhood. And so what you're talking about when you're saying that, people don't interact in a friendly way is not at campaign rallies they hate each other. It's in the bakery they hate each other. Ibu Patel, who's based in Chicago and has a great new book out, has the example of the fire departments in Mostar in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the Catholic fire department will not help you if you're a Muslim and your house is on fire, and the Muslim fire department will not help you if you're a Catholic and your house is on fire. We're not there. We have a different kind of problem. And so how do you deal with that? Well, part of it has to be changes in our political institutions. Now, of course, our constitution makes some of those changes difficult. I'm perfectly in favor of multi-member districts and certain number of things, ways of trying to deal with gerrymandering and so on, which would be helpful. I'm not sure how realistic it is that we'll make great progress on that. But even some more modest institutional changes, which are achievable and have been achieved in certain states, could, I think, make a difference. So I've come to believe that primaries are a big mistake because they raise democratic participation, but they don't raise it enough. You have real legitimacy if you have 50, 70, hopefully 85% of the population participating in an election. You can have sensible institutions when you have a small number of stakeholders driving decisions about them. But when you have 2 to 10% of the population participating in an election, that's not actually representative. It simply favors the ideological extremes. And so one thing we can do about that is to have so-called jungle primaries, as they do in California, in which you have a first round in which everybody from every party runs, and then there's a runoff between two candidates. And that gives incentives for relatively more moderate parties, relatively more moderate candidates in California, because suddenly there's a way of winning as a moderate Dem, but also in places like Alabama, because suddenly there would be, if they introduce the same system, a way of winning in Alabama as a moderate Republican who's not in bed with Donald Trump, right? So there are some institutional fixes like that. But basically, when I look at the sociological processes in the heart of our society, I'm quite optimistic. When I look at the level of high politics and what we might face in 2024 and 2028, I'm quite pessimistic, essentially for the reasons that you outline.
I'm going to ask you the question that people are always asking me, and I never have a good answer. What about the information environment, the news environment, the social media, the sort of siloing of our information sources, the self-selection to information that we like that gives us confirmation bias, the selection out of even any kind of exposure to contrary points of view. What do you do about that?
So I think it's plausible that this is a big driving mechanism. It's interesting in the study that I was writing about that worldwide polarization starts to increase around 2005. That's pretty close to, I forget exactly which year Facebook was founded, but it was something like 2005, perhaps a few years earlier, but it's when it starts to take off. So I think there's good reason to think that all of those mechanisms that you alluded to are one of the drivers of polarization, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well. I am nevertheless a little bit concerned about the way in which people often talk about this topic. And in particular, I'm very skeptical of the usefulness of a misinformation paradigm. First, it's not clear to me that people believe more, crazy shit today than they used to. I think for complicated reasons, people with crazy beliefs have more power than they used to, but it's not clear to me that more people believe them. So, it's very hard to measure, but I think about 10% of US population have any form of real belief in something like QAnon. About 10% of US population in 1999 believed that the moon landing was fake. So, you're always going to have some people believing crazy stuff. It's always been the case. It always will be the case. That is not the problem. The problem is when they can act together and activate and actually take over institutions. That is what we should be worried about. More broadly, when you look at the track record of how we've dealt with misinformation in the last few years, I think we have to be very self-critical on the two major topics in which viewpoints were suppressed because of claims that they consisted in misinformation or amounted to misinformation. We pretty much got it wrong. So the first of those was the so-called lab leak theory. And I'm not talking about the crazier version of it. I'm talking about the version which said that there was gain-of-function research at the lab in Wuhan and that there may have been a breach in safety protocols such that the virus originated from there. This was censored from YouTube and Facebook and other social media platforms. There was a Nobel Prize winner in virology who was arguing for this theory and whose accounts were suspended. And at this point, we still don't know the truth of the matter. I'm not saying that this theory is right. We don't know, I don't think. But certainly, we have government agencies in the United States who believe in this now. There's other government agencies who don't believe in it. I think it's an open question. But the fact that for a year and a half, in the middle of a pandemic, we're not able to discuss this question openly, and that, by the way, the mainstream media did not talk about it in an open-minded way. It only started to do so when sort of the topic shifted. I think is really worrying about our ability to have difficult conversations that we need in order to make right decisions and in order to understand the world. The second example is one that I really don't have any personal stake in. It certainly would not have changed how I would have voted in 2020. But I think when you pause to think about it, it becomes quite uncomfortable. And that is the New York Post story about Hunter Biden's laptop, which resulted not just in this story being censored on Twitter, but in the entire social media channel of one of the big newspapers in the country, not a newspaper I particularly like, but one of the big newspapers in this country being censored. And at this point, the New York Times has confirmed the basic factual claims in that article as being truthful. So I really worry that we're rushing into an abandonment of forms of free speech and a discourse which allows the right to own the value of free speech, which has always been a philosophical liberal value, but also in more political valence, a left-wing value, and for good reason. And I think that is very short-sighted. So What do we do about that? I think that there are some algorithms which are more helpful than others. I do think one of the big problems of Twitter in particular is, and of Facebook in a certain way, is that it surfaces the thoughts and the comments that are most controversial, and therefore encourages this polarization machine. I think if you look at something like Reddit, it's actually much better because the top comments are the ones that have the biggest delta between upvotes and downvotes. And so, it has to have enough content for someone to want to upvote it, but it has to be consensual enough that a lot of people don't downvote it. And so the kind of tweet that would go super viral is not a comment that performs very well on Reddit. And on that, I think we should hope that eventually the users of social media platforms are going to get so fed up with the acrimony on it that the people running it have an incentive to redesign algorithms in ways that make it, frankly, a more pleasant experience to be on those platforms, and as an externality that make them less destructive of our institutions.
Okay, we have a question from an audience member. While we may not have religion and ethnicity as identifying our polarities, don't we have geography, red versus blue states? I find myself associating license plates with outsiders. Great question.
Interesting. License plates with outsiders. Well, look, I mean, the tendency to worry about outsiders coming in is always there. I'm going to make myself even more unpopular by saying something else provocative, which is that I find it interesting that there's the discourse about immigration at the national level, which pits the left versus the right in a particular kind of way, and in which people on the left, in which I count myself, often think that if you have concerns about not having control over who comes in, or if you want to steer to some extent who comes into the country, that is unacceptable and racist and so on, you have a very different debate. I'm not saying it's the same, but there is some interesting echoes about gentrification, in which it's a debate between progressives and liberals, perhaps, if you want, in which suddenly the polarities are turned around, and there's it's politically virtuous to say, well, people coming in is really a bad thing in a program and so on. And if you're saying, well, actually, perhaps people should be able to come in as they want and so on, that is supposed to be the less left-wing or the less progressive position. So, the tendency to say, to draw lines of groups always goes deeper and is more mellifluous than people think. I love a quote by Tom Lehrer, where he said many decades ago, it's really important that we like our fellow human beings, and some people do not like their fellow human beings, and I hate people like that, which indicates that nicely. So I'd say two things about this. One is it goes back to Sue's point that partisan polarization is actually, in some ways, the deepest challenge today. It is we do not have a clash between states in which one ethnicity is concentrated and states in which another ethnicity is concentrated. We have a clash between blue states and red states, between Democrat states and Republican states, between left-leaning and right-leaning Americans, and that's a fundamental division of our society. And the second will be to reiterate that we should all try to keep that disdain in check, that you can criticize very strongly politicians and political leaders, and I certainly have written in very clear terms about my concerns about Donald Trump and the Republican Party and the threat they pose to democracy. But you have to have some amount of openness towards your fellow citizens. And when they keep voting for parties that you consider a threat, I think you have to ask yourself why they're doing that and how you convince them, rather than to conclude there must be terrible human beings who you don't want to share a country with, because that's just not a realistic path forward.
I was very struck by the discussion of groupishness in your book, and you're reminding us that that we can light on extremely trivial and meaningless differences in order to and end up hating each other over those differences. You have a nice example of that you mentioned, is a hot dog a sandwich or not? And I'm still grappling with that one myself. There's a nice sort of, not nice, but it's funny example from the history of our sociology department here at the University of Chicago, where they were at one point divided between two different geographic locations or building locations because of some renovations that were going on, and then of course factions arose between those two different groups. And to sort of put on the optimist hat, sort of my feeling is that sometimes problems come along that show us that those differences are really trivial and that we don't have time for them, and that we really have needs to, we need each other. We need each other for some bigger end, and we need to make sure the class ends on time, so we're going to stop arguing about hot dogs, or we need to show the dean that we're worthy of hiring more sociologists, so we're going to get over this silly difference. I told you that I'm irritatingly optimistic. I was trying to find a silver lining in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, sort of along those lines. I mean, who cares about these silly cultural differences that we like to be fighting over in the United States, when a country that we, for whatever reasons we can find appealing and rather admirable, is under assault from a neighboring country that's an autocracy and that is cruel to its own people as well as to its neighbors. I'm not sure I feel that same optimism anymore, but I'm curious about your reflections on, I guess, the particularities of the war and the effects that might be having, and the more general idea that maybe what we need is to, sort of get our, stop crying over silly things because we can imagine crying over really big things.
I once saw, and I've been trying to find it, and I haven't been able to find it. So if anybody in the audience, or if you know this paper, please send it my way. The thing that I wanted to actually use it to make this point in the book, and I just could not track down this paper, but it makes a relatively obvious point in a funny way, which is that it got a bunch of people into a lab, or perhaps I dreamt it up, but I think I saw it somewhere. And it got a bunch of people into the labs, and it got them. It gave him one text from NASA saying, we have now definitively confirmed there's no alien life. And then it asked him, how do you feel if you're worried about African Americans or something like that, right? And then the other one is like, we have confirmed the existence of alien life. They're out there, and we're worried that we may be preparing for war. How do you feel about African Americans? And of course, the second group, which is primed to think about the existing of a really threatening outsider, far away, outside not just their own society, but in fact outside the human species, suddenly comes to have much more positive views towards their fellow citizens that belong to a different group, right? And so that is obviously a basic human mechanism, a basic in-group, out-group mechanism that, what's universal is that you're a member of a group and that you like the members of a group and that you dislike the members, those who are not a member of a group. Now, your definition of your group might be, I'm part of a group of the kinds of people who don't define themselves by a group, and screw all those people who are groupish, but you're just making an intellectual mistake. Now, where those boundaries between groups lie does depend on context. It's one of the reasons why I think that we need a form of patriotism, because the subnational groups are always going to come naturally to us. And that's fine, right? We will have different cultural groups, different ethnic groups within the United States, different religious groups, obviously. And that's one of the things that makes up the richness of this country as well. But on top of that, we need a level of having a shared identity as Americans, precisely so that we don't end up too tempted by the mechanisms of outgroup discrimination that come with the subnational identity group. And so I think it's plausible to think that one of the things that made American society somewhat more placid for at least parts of the Cold War period was the threat from the Soviet Union. And it's plausible to think that if Russia continues to be a real threat to international peace, and if, which is not yet clear, but seems at least very possible, China becomes a threatening competitor to the United States in the next decades, perhaps that'll allow us to have more in-group solidarity as Americans or as members of free societies which want to continue being self-governing democracies. I think it's plausible as a thought. Of course, it would come at a terrible price. So it's not something that I'm hoping for, but it could indeed be what's the word, not a redeeming virtue, but one positive side effect of a worrying development.
I don't know that paper. I'm not sure I've seen a reference to it. So, but I'll keep my antennae up. We at Bright Line Watch, which I'm
your antenna, does that suggest that you're an alien?
We at Bright Line Watch, which is a group that I'm part of, and we do surveys of Americans, what they think about democracy and so on. We did something that sort of sounds like what you just mentioned. That we got people to tell us how they think that people from their own party and people from the other party, how much they value different aspects of democracy. How important or essential is it that we have free and fair elections and the like. And they were very far off. They even fellow Democrats thought, didn't believe in these things as much as they actually did. And certainly when it came to talking about the other party, they very much underestimated the values that were placed on these things. So then we corrected those views. We told them, well, you got that wrong. It's actually not, 60%, it's 90%. And then we asked them, this is and how do you feel about African Americans? So then we asked them, well, how much do you embrace the following? How much would you tolerate the following kinds of actions? Using violence to get the other side from attacking democracy and things that are very much violations of democracy. We got no movement at all. So there you have it. On the other hand, we have been successful in getting people to shift their beliefs about the fairness of the election by giving them more information about how audits work. So there you have it. So I think we are coming toward the end. And this has been a fascinating conversation. I really think that the questions that you're posing in the book are terrific. I think they don't lend themselves to easy answers, but you have also lots of great creative ideas about what the answers would be. So is there anything, we have about a minute, anything that you'd like to add before we close?
Well, let me just say this, that it can feel sometimes, given the real challenges we have, which we have to take very seriously, that sort of the smart option and the strategically perhaps sensible option is cynicism. But we need to actually sustain a social consensus that we want to build these equal and diverse democracies, that this is something, a challenge that we won't get around. The only way to get around it is through extreme forms of injustice and violence. And so we needed to succeed. And that's something of which we have to convince our fellow citizens. And I think painting the vision of a society that most people would actually want to live in is the only way to do that. I've tried to paint my vision of that kind of society in this book. It would be great if there's other competing visions or visions that are in conversation with that. But I think we need to put much more focus on here's the kind of society that we should want to live in together, and here's a realistic path to get there. Because the less we have that, the harder it will be to get there. The easier people will find it to say, what hope is there even? Why should I even try? Perhaps the simplest way is simply to turn back the clock or to vote for people who are promising that I don't have to deal with any of that. So perhaps that is a closing thought.
Couldn't agree more. Here's the book, folks. It's really great. The Great Experiment: Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. Yascha Mounk, thank you so much for joining us, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much. Hope to see you soon in a park.